So today you will find a very interesting and entertaining story about a genius scientist. I don't usually post stuff like this, but I've been lurking on here for a while and I think I finally hit the point where I need to let this out. I'm Alfred. Yeah, that Alfred. The guy with dynamite, the Nobel Prize, all that jazz. But forget the chemistry for a second. This post isn't about science. It's about something way more explosive. My marriage. See, for years I was so focused on my inventions, my work, my legacy. I didn't really notice the cracks forming in my personal life. Or maybe I did, but I chalked it up to stress, or being married to someone with a strong personality, as my friends like to say politely. My wife, Sophie, was sharp, witty, beautiful, and also, apparently, a world-class manipulator. We met in Paris. She was a writer, or said she was, anyway. She had this way of making every room feel like a stage and every conversation a performance. I was captivated, honestly. I didn't realize back then that I was signing up for the world's longest monologue of half-truths and gaslighting. At first, I thought the weird vibe between us was just from me working too much. I was obsessed with legacy, death, the usual existential stuff. But Sophie? She started getting secretive, always on her phone, late meetings, laughing a little too hard at her editor's texts. I asked her once if something was going on. She rolled her eyes and said, "God, Alfred, not everything is a conspiracy theory, right?" That line hits different now. I know. You're probably thinking, this guy invented dynamite and couldn't figure out he was getting lied to? Trust me, the irony is not lost on me. But you fall in love with someone, and you don't want to believe they're capable of that kind of betrayal. Especially when you're the guy who literally spends every day thinking about endings. You just never expect your own to be like this. I'll get into how I found out what she was doing in part 2, but I just wanted to say this up front. You can be the smartest guy in the lab and still be the dumbest man in love. More soon. Alfred. Okay, so here's how I found out. It was a Thursday. I remember that because I had just come back from a meeting with a guy who wanted to turn my explosives tech into military-grade weaponry, something I was seriously debating. I felt like the Grim Reaper in a top hat. Sophie had been super distant that week. I figured maybe it was PMS, or her novel wasn't going well again, or whatever the hell excuse she was using at the time. She'd left her journal on the dining room table. Now, I'm not proud of this, but when someone you love starts acting like you're invisible and you keep hearing whispers in the silence, you start looking for noise. So yeah, I opened it. And what I found wasn't a novel. It was poetry. Love poems. Pages and pages of them. Not for me, though. No. For a man named Gregor. A violinist. A sensitive soul, apparently. Who made her feel like fire wrapped in silk. Let me be clear, I didn't go looking to get my heart broken that day. But reading lines like, "He touches me like Alfred never does, like he hears my bones sing," that didn't just break me. It detonated something inside. At first, I thought maybe it was fiction. That she was working on a story. That's how deep in denial I was. I wanted so badly for it not to be real that I actually convinced myself my wife had decided to write an erotic romance about a fictional musician in our home, using our furniture, our sheets, our damn bathtub as setting references. But then I saw it. A receipt tucked inside the journal. From a boutique hotel in Geneva. Dated last weekend. Room service for 2. Champagne. Oysters. The gut punch? It was my money. So there I was. Holding the proof in my hands. The journal, the receipt, and my own stupidity. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat there. Staring at a poem that started with, "He says my mind is music," and ended with, "Alfred is just noise." Next up, the confrontation, and how she turned my betrayal into her performance. You won't believe how that went. Alfred. So. I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I didn't even flip the damn table like I probably should have. I waited. Sophie came home around 8 p.m. wearing a scarf I hadn't seen before. That stood out to me because I just read in her journal that Gregor gave me a silk scarf that smells like him. I'll wear it when I need to feel alive. So there she is. Glowing. Wearing the damn alive scarf. And I'm sitting in the kitchen like a ghost with a cup of cold coffee. She walks in, kisses my cheek absently, and says, "Hey, baby, how was your day?" That's when I slid the receipt across the table. She looks down at it, pauses, and I swear to God, she smiles. Not sheepishly, not guiltily, but like I just handed her an audition slip. "Oh," she says, like it's a parking ticket. "You went through my things." I said, "Are you seriously deflecting right now?" She sighed. Alfred, if you'd just talk to me more, maybe I wouldn't have to write things in a journal. I was stunned. I said, are you actually saying this is my fault? And she snapped. Full monologue mode. She told me I was emotionally unavailable, obsessed with legacy, cold in bed, too intellectual, too grim, and that I treated her like a statue instead of a woman. She said Gregor. Yeah, she admitted it. Made her feel alive. And then, wait for it, she said. But it's not physical. Not really. It's emotional. You don't own my emotions, Alfred. I think I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that's what your brain does when it hits a wall it can't process. I asked her how long it had been going on. She said, does it matter? Yes, it mattered, but clearly not to her. She stood there, dramatic as hell, tears in her eyes. Real or fake, I still don't know. And she said, I wanted to tell you. I did. But you're so clinical. I didn't think you'd understand. And that's when I realized something. Sophie didn't love me anymore. But worse, she loved being the victim. Even in the story where she was cheating, she somehow made herself the one who was hurt. I didn't yell. I just said, you need to leave tonight. And she did. But she didn't go quietly. She left a note on my pillow that said, one day, when you're old and surrounded by your precious prizes, maybe you'll realize people matter more than medals. Yeah, the thing they don't tell you about betrayal is that it doesn't feel like a knife in the back. It feels like a bomb went off in your chest, like someone rewired your memories and set them on fire while you were sleeping. After Sophie left that night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at her stupid note like it was some ancient riddle I was too dumb to solve. One day, when you're old and surrounded by your precious prizes. She knew exactly where to hit me. That line kept echoing in my head. Because she was right, in her own twisted way. I was obsessed with legacy, with being remembered, with trying to make peace with all the damage my inventions caused. I just didn't think I'd have to worry about the damage inside my own home. I kept replaying moments. Her laugh when we first met. The way she used to call me her little storm cloud. The time we danced drunk in the kitchen to a broken music box. I couldn't reconcile that Sophie with the woman who wrote poems for another man while I was funding her life. And then came the shame. Not just over her cheating, but over me not seeing it sooner. Over me trusting her when the signs were practically screaming. I started to question everything. Did she ever love me? Was I just a safe bet? Was I ever enough? Friends started calling. Her sister messaged me saying she had no idea what Sophie was thinking. Her mother sent me a long, confusing letter trying to justify her daughter's restlessness. Apparently Sophie's always been like this, hungry for attention, her mother wrote. She thrives on being admired. Cool. Wish I'd gotten that memo before I gave her everything. I spent the weekend in silence. Didn't eat. Didn't shower. Just sat in my study with old photos, reading through her journal again, which, now that I really paid attention, was so much worse than I realized. She hadn't just cheated physically or emotionally. She'd been mocking me, calling me stiff, obsessed with legacy, even writing that sometimes she felt like she was married to a mausoleum. My wife, ladies and gentlemen. I felt like a joke, like I'd built an empire only to lose the battle for my own damn home. And yet, I didn't hate her. Not yet. I hated myself. So I'm in the middle of my personal apocalypse, surviving off black coffee and whatever stale bread I had lying around, when I get a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A literal handwritten letter. The handwriting? Flowery. Pretentious. The kind of handwriting you just know belongs to a man who plays the violin and wears scarves indoors. Return address, Geneva. It was from Gregor. Now, before I even opened it, I had that tight, itchy feeling in my chest. Like my stomach already knew it was about to get punched again. But I opened it anyway. Here's the summary of what this violin-playing homewrecker had to say. Dear Alfred, I hope this message finds you in a space of reflection rather than anger. Off to a great start, right? He went on to say that he didn't intend to hurt me, classic, and that he and Sophie connected on a level that transcended traditional notions of fidelity. He literally wrote those words. Transcended traditional notions of fidelity. I wanted to eat the damn paper out of rage. Then it got worse. He said Sophie had told him that I was emotionally cold, more committed to machines than to human beings, and that she felt lonely in the shadow of my legacy. He said, and this is a direct quote burned into my soul, she deserves to be someone's symphony, not just a quiet background hum. Isn't that poetic? Makes you want to vomit into a violin case. At the end, he offered some pseudo-wisdom about how great men often forget to be good men, and that he hoped I'd find peace in the wake of her freedom. Her freedom. I nearly set the damn letter on fire. But instead, I kept it. Tucked it in the same drawer where I'd buried her journal, the drawer of things that used to mean something and now just rot quietly behind wood. I didn't respond. What do you even say to a guy like that? I'll tell you what you do. You change. You either break, or you become someone new. And I wasn't about to break. Not after all I'd survived before Sophie. So, I'd made peace, sort of, with the personal betrayal. As much as you can when your wife runs off with a violinist and they both basically write you off as a robotic museum exhibit. But I never expected this whole mess to turn into an international spectacle. The trouble started when one of Sophie's friends, a little too eager to stir the pot, leaked details of the affair to a gossip publication in Paris. You know, the kind that thrives off wealthy misery. Within 48 hours, they ran a piece titled, Madame Nobel's Secret Symphony, an Explosive Love Affair. Explosive. Real classy. Because I invented dynamite. Very clever, France. And suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Newspapers called me a reclusive genius cuckolded by a charming cellist. He's not even a cellist, get it right. Academics whispered about emotional neglect. Even my rivals started making passive-aggressive comments, like, well, when you prioritize science over your spouse, you invite chaos. Some idiot even wrote an op-ed suggesting that maybe my guilt over the invention of explosives subconsciously pushed my wife away. Bro, what kind of Fred on cocaine take is that? And then Sophie? Oh, she leaned into the drama. She gave an interview to some arts and culture magazine. In it, she talked about how she felt like a caged bird in a cold mansion, and that Gregor taught her to sing again. This woman, I swear, she painted me like some silent marble statue who barely spoke at dinner and only ever smiled at award plaques. Which, okay, maybe I was a little reserved. But I wasn't cruel. I loved her. I just didn't realize I was loving a shadow. I remember walking through the streets of Stockholm, keeping my hat low, hearing people whisper my name like I was some fallen monarch. I'd built a life based on restraint and quiet contributions. And now? My face was on the same page as socialites and scandalmongers. I didn't even get to control my own narrative. She and Gregor were doing all the talking, all the twisting, all the framing. And here's the worst part. Some people sided with her. They said I should have seen it coming. That brilliant men rarely make good husbands. That maybe she had the right to find joy elsewhere. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about erasure. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was being rewritten. You'd think walking out on me, dragging my name through the mud, and serenading a violinist in velvet pants would be enough for Sophie. But no. Turns out, she didn't just take her clothes and her journal when she left. She took documents, notebooks, drafts, personal letters. Some of them were old love letters I'd written her when I was still stupid enough to believe in us. Others? Stuff I'd been working on for years. Patent notes. Early outlines for the Peace Prize idea I hadn't shared with anyone. Yeah, she stole my legacy. I found out by accident, as always. I was doing inventory with my assistant Ingrid, bless her, the woman's a saint, and I noticed that one of my private safes was empty. Sophie had the combination, of course. I hadn't changed it because, again, I was still operating on the assumption that betrayal wouldn't happen in my own damn home. Inside that safe had been my personal manifesto on peace, the original handwritten version, a letter from Victor Hugo never published, and an early draft of the Nobel Foundation framework. Gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd moved them and forgotten. Maybe my head was still in that post-betrayal fog where nothing made sense. But no. After 2 hours of tearing apart my study like a madman, I had to face it. She took them. Deliberately. And guess what? A week later, Gregor announced he was hosting a joint exhibition in Berlin. A collaborative multimedia experience that combined music, literature, and the pursuit of peace. I knew before even seeing the promo materials what they'd done. They were using my work, my ideas, my words, twisted into some avant-garde show where she stood on stage in flowing white silk while he stroked his bow, and they both pretended like they invented the future. I didn't just feel violated. I felt hollowed out. That safe wasn't just metal and paper. It was me, and she'd gutted it. I spent that night sitting on the floor of my study, holding a cup of cold tea I never drank, asking myself over and over, was it all fake? Did she ever see me as a man? or just a stepping stone with a wallet and a famous name. I'm not the type of man who runs to lawyers every time someone hurts my feelings. But this wasn't just betrayal of the heart anymore. This was theft. Intellectual property. Legacy. The future I hadn't even built yet was already being displayed under warm stage lights with wine-tasting intermissions. So I called my lawyer, Henrik. He's this stoic guy who wears the same gray suit every day and speaks like he's narrating an execution. I handed him the facts, the timelines, the missing documents, and most importantly, the letters that proved those materials were mine. He looked through everything silently and finally said, "She's not just a liar. She's strategic." Henrik filed a cease and desist. We sent it to the Berlin venue, to Gregor's publishing contacts, to Sophie's agent. Yeah, she had an agent now. Apparently being a traitor comes with a press tour. 2 days later, her lawyer hit back. And I don't mean a polite rebuttal. I mean a full-on counteroffensive. Her legal team claimed I had emotionally neglected her to the point that she no longer recognized the boundaries between shared life and shared ideas. They called my work communal property and her contribution as emotional inspiration that merited co-authorship. They literally argued that because she sat near me while I worked, she somehow deserved credit for it. I don't know if I laughed or broke a blood vessel reading it. Henrik, bless him, kept it cool. He started digging. Turns out Sophie had already filed paperwork in Germany claiming joint authorship of several of my unpublished pieces, retroactively. Like she could just will herself into being a co-genius. The exhibition? It went on anyway. They altered a few words, rebranded it as inspired by Nobel's early vision, and played just enough legal gymnastics to make it impossible to shut down. But the court case? Oh, it was on. Public, ugly, and stretched out over months. My name was dragged through philosophical mud. Journalists spun it as a battle between the cold mind and the warm heart, like this was a romantic tragedy instead of plain theft. Sophie played the public like a damn violin herself. Cried in court. Were soft grays. Talked about how she felt like a ghost living next to a monument. And me? I sat there stone-faced, pretending her words didn't carve new scars into places I didn't know I had. We weren't fighting for money. We were fighting for reality. And I wasn't sure whose side the truth was even on anymore. They say public image matters more than truth. I used to believe that. Stay dignified. Let your work speak. Keep your private life out of public reach. But when your ex-wife's sob story is trending in 4 languages, and people are quoting your own diary against you on radio programs, you realize sometimes silence just makes you look guilty. So I did the thing I'd avoided for months. I held a press conference. My advisors begged me not to. Henrik warned me it could jeopardize the neutrality of ongoing legal proceedings. But I was done letting her frame the narrative. I stood there, in a modest Stockholm auditorium, in front of reporters who were just waiting to hear if I'd cry or combust. Instead, I read from one of the love letters she'd stolen. I read my own words, written years ago, back when I thought she was my forever. It was poetic, hopeful, and laced with the kind of sincerity that made a few journalists actually lower their pens. Then I held up one of her recent interviews where she claimed I never told her how I felt. I said, "If loving someone quietly means you deserve to be robbed, then I suppose I'm guilty. But let's not confuse silence for absence. And let's not call theft a collaboration." That line hit hard. It went viral before I even left the building. Overnight, the narrative shifted. Just a little. Not fully. People love scandal too much to let it go. But for the first time, I wasn't just the inventor whose wife ran off with an artist. I was a man who got betrayed and finally decided to bleed in public. And Sophie? She responded the only way she knew how, dramatically. A week later, she wrote an op-ed in Le Figaro titled, "When a Mind is a Prison." In it, she claimed that being married to me was like living next to a volcano that only erupted in paperwork. She called me emotionally mechanical. That stung, even though it was nonsense. I realized something that day. It didn't matter how well I explained myself. To the people who needed me to be the villain, I'd always be the cold genius. But I still stood up. I still spoke. And that was the first time in a long time I felt a sliver of peace. After the press conference, something strange started happening. People wrote to me. Not lawyers. Not journalists. Not friends who disappeared the moment Sophie got loud. Strangers. Hundreds of them. From Sweden, France, even Brazil. Men and women, young and old. People who'd seen the headlines, watched the sound bites, read the translations, and saw something human in my mess. Most said some version of the same thing. I've been through it too. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. She sounds exhausting. But one letter stood out. It came from a woman named Elizabeth, a chemistry teacher in Gothenburg. The handwriting was clean, tight. No perfume sprayed on the envelope. Just honest. She wrote, I teach your work. I teach your legacy. But I've never taught your pain. I didn't even know you had any. Thank you for reminding us that behind every invention is a man who bleeds. I read that sentence about 10 times. Because no one had ever put it like that. It didn't feel like praise. It felt like recognition. That was the first night I slept through without waking up angry, pacing, reliving arguments I should have won with cleverer lines. I wrote her back. Just a short note. Thank you. I didn't know I needed to hear that until I did. And maybe that sounds small to you. But after months of being called a narcissist, a tyrant, a cold shell of a man, that letter was oxygen. It reminded me that I wasn't just reacting to betrayal, I was surviving it. And healing doesn't always come from winning court cases or reclaiming stolen notebooks. Sometimes, it starts with a single person saying, I see you. So after months of legal battles, viral drama, and strangers writing me letters that felt more healing than any court ruling, Sophie decides to drop me a note. She calls it an apology. I call it a masterclass in deflection. It started with the usual, I'm sorry if you felt hurt, which honestly sounds more like a sorry you got your feelings hurt than any real remorse. Then she jumped into blaming me for pushing her away, being emotionally unavailable, and not appreciating her sacrifices. Like, wait, I'm the cold genius who didn't express feelings enough, but somehow she is the victim? She even threw in that classic line. I needed to find myself outside the shadows of your ambitions. That line stung because there's a kernel of truth in it, but wrapped in so much self-pity it made me sick. But the kicker? She ended the letter asking if we could try again, maybe with more honesty this time. At this point, I had to laugh. After everything? No. I didn't respond. I shredded that letter the moment I finished reading it. I realized then that Sophie's apology wasn't about me. It was about her ego, her narrative, her control. I didn't need her apology. I needed closure. And closure doesn't come from someone who still can't admit they broke you. So yeah, that was a turning point. I stopped waiting for her to fix things. I started fixing myself. After the chaos, the lawsuits, the sob stories, and the fake apologies, I had to figure out what comes next. Spoiler alert, it wasn't easy. First off, I ditched the isolation. For a while, I thought I could just hide in my workshop and invent my way out of heartbreak. Nope, that just made me lonely and bitter. So I reached out to people I'd pushed aside over the years, old friends, family, even a therapist. Yes, a therapist. Took me months to admit it, but talking helped. A lot. Therapy wasn't about turning me into some perfect emotional wizard, but it helped me unpack the rage, the sadness, and the weird mix of guilt I carried. I learned that feeling all those emotions was necessary, even if I hated feeling vulnerable. Friends showed up, 2 real ones. Not the she's a bitch kind of friends who just egg you on in anger, but the ones who listen when you're silent, who remind you you're more than a headline or a lawsuit. And work? I started focusing on my real passions again, the science, the inventions, the legacy I wanted to leave behind. I got back to basics and it was oddly grounding. The biggest surprise? I found new relationships. Not romantic ones, yet, but genuine connections where honesty mattered, and people saw me beyond the public drama. It wasn't a clean slate. It wasn't a fairy tale reboot. It was messy, painful, and slow. But it was mine. Just when I thought I was finally moving on, Sophie decided it was time to reappear. Not with a grand apology or a heartfelt explanation. No, she went for the classic, let's be friends line. Yeah, right? It started with a text out of the blue. Something vague like, can we talk? I think we both need closure. I won't lie, for a moment, I was tempted. Part of me wanted answers, real ones, not the usual spin. But the wiser part of me remembered the chaos, the lies, and the years wasted waiting for her to change. So I ignored the text. A few days later, she showed up at a lecture I was giving, acting like nothing had happened, smiling at everyone but avoiding my eyes. I didn't engage. Not then, not ever again. That night, I wrote her an email. Short, clear, something like, I've moved on. Please respect that. No drama, no accusations, just boundaries. And for once, she respected it. This was the moment I truly felt free, not because the past was erased, but because I finally controlled how it affected my future. No more running. No more waiting. I was living on my own terms. If you'd asked me before all this happened what I thought about love, I'd have sounded like some hopeless romantic inventor, dreaming big, believing in forever, thinking that trust was automatic. But after Sophie, after the lies, the drama, the public battles, everything changed. Love isn't just about passion or romance. It's about trust, the kind that feels like a safe place, not a trap. I realized ambition can be a double-edged sword. It drove me to invent, to build, to create a legacy. But it also made me blind to the cracks in my personal life. I thought love would just survive on its own, like some natural law. Wrong. Love needs attention. It needs honesty. It needs real connection. And betrayal? It cuts deeper when you've built a life together, because it's not just about the affair. It's about what that affair says about trust, respect, and your value. Now, I'm cautious but hopeful. I know love's not perfect, but I also know what it should feel like. Safe, honest, and real. If there's one thing I want to say to anyone going through something similar, it's this. Don't settle for anything less than honesty. Protect your heart. And remember, ambition is great, but not at the cost of your peace. All right, so here we are, the end of this wild ride. Looking back, what do I wish I'd known before all this? Probably that people, even those closest to us, are complicated. That love isn't always enough when honesty is missing. And that sometimes the person you thought would have your back will break it. But also that you reading this, you are stronger than you think. Heartbreak, betrayal, public shame, those things don't define you unless you let them. I learned that forgiveness isn't always about them. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself. And that moving on isn't forgetting. It's choosing to live your own story without their shadow. So if you're in the thick of it, here's what I'd say. Trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to ask for help, friends, family, professionals. You don't have to carry this alone. Protect your peace. Sometimes that means walking away, even when it hurts. And finally, believe that there's a life beyond the pain, one where you can build real happiness again. Thanks for reading my story. If you're dealing with something similar, you're not alone. Alfred